Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Studio Talk. My name is Barry Johns. And so I've had a lot of viewers request that I touch on this particular subject matter, and that is if someone wants to start getting into analog hardware and incorporating that into their DAW, that they'd like to get some advice on how to do that. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. And so before we get into that subject, I would appreciate it if you watch my channel and you check out my content and you like it and you find it helpful, because that is why I do it, to help you. If you find it helpful, then please do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and then like the video if you like it. All I'm asking is a little give and take. I'm doing this, I'm putting a lot of work and effort into getting these videos out to you folks, so I would appreciate your support. It means a lot. Now let's move on to the subject. Okay, so before, in the following series, I'm actually going to give recommendations to specific pieces of gear that I've personally used, as well as talk about some gear that I have friends and I've researched, okay? So before I do that, I think we've got to get to the fundamental of this, and that is, let's first understand what a hardware insert is. Every DAW out there that I'm aware of, certainly all of the major players, have the ability to route the audio signal out of the interface into external hardware and then bring that back in and record or process that result. And so just like today, your very first thing that you set up when you buy an interface is, after you get it connected to the computer and all that stuff, is you're going to select two of your outputs to your studio monitors. And so that's going to be one of the first things. So understand that if you're going to incorporate outboard hardware, you're going to need more than 2 in and 2 out on your interface, because you're always going to have two outputs on your interface to feed to your studio monitors. Now, I'm keeping this simple on the surface. There are other examples where you could do things differently through Maddie and Dante and all that stuff, but ignore that I said that. For general understanding, you always want to maintain 2 of your outputs for your studio monitors, and if you have 2 sets of monitors, then you need 4 outputs on your interface to do that. So that's why I often recommend that a person who really sees themselves trying to incorporate analog hardware into their workflow, that they only pick interfaces that have at least 4 in and 4 out, giving you 2 in to record some basic things, 2 out to go to your monitors, and then the other 2 in and 2 out could feed your hardware inserts. And those don't have to be connected all the time. They can be connected only when you need them, either directly to your interface or through a patch bay. So I think it's important to understand what a hardware insert is, kind of where that comes from. If you've just started doing this in the last 15, 20 years, a lot has changed. A lot has changed. I would probably think that most, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I would think that most home recordists really don't have a lot of one-on-one experience using analog processing, again, i.e. compression, EQ, mic preamps, outside of their existing interface. I think most people probably just track through their interface and then use plugins for their processing, which is more than fine. But if you want to kind of explore some of these other areas where you can expand your options, okay, that's when you want to incorporate analog hardware into your thing. So again, let's talk about when you're in your digital audio workstation. So I'm going to keep this really simple. Digital audio workstation is like Cubase, Nuendo, Reaper, Studio One, Pro Tools, Digital Performer, Logic, Fruity Loops, or Florida Studio, or FL Studio, whatever they call it today, Ableton, all of those things. Now, some of those that I just mentioned are more geared towards virtual instruments and that type of thing. But the majority of your DAWs out there have the ability to do analog inserts, hardware inserts within the DAW. So when you're picturing your channel strip, right, all your faders and everything in your mix project, right, So let's say, for example, on track 10, you've got a snare drum. And on that snare drum, you would like to send that out of your interface into an outboard piece of compression, let's say an 1176 as an example, or an 1176 clone, that type of thing, that you can do that, but you have to set that up in your DAW. Now, every DAW does it slightly different. There are some idiosyncrasies and some, as an example, if you're in Pro Tools, and this one always drove me nuts because it was so restrictive, but it just goes back to that ancient code that they've been relying on for the last 25 years and haven't really rewritten that very well. So like I said before, you've got a snare drum track on track 10, and you want to be able to send that audio recording out of your interface into an outboard compression and bring that back in. Now, to be able to do that, you have to do physical connections, and that's plugging in cables on the back of your interface as well as the rear or wherever it is, wherever the inputs and outputs are on your outboard hardware piece. You've got to manually, physically connect those, right? But you also have to set it up and tell the DAW what you're doing. Now, if you're not familiar with how to create a hardware insert in your DAW, I happen to use Nuendo, but I own Logic and Studio One and Reaper and Pro Tools. I own all of those. And so I've learned how to do it in all of those. But whatever DAW you're using, my first suggestion is just simply either pull up the manual and find it that way, or just simply do a YouTube search on how to create a hardware insert in Cubase, how to create a hardware insert in Logic, how to do it in Studio One. And just watch the video and they'll show you how you need to route it, because internally in your digital audio workstation, you're going to assign that hardware insert just like you would a normal plugin, right? Just like a normal plugin, you're going to assign that hardware insert to your track. And so that hardware insert needs to be told, what output am I sending this signal out of on the interface, okay? And then once it comes back in from the outboard hardware, let's keep compression in this, a 1176 clone on a snare as an example. For that to come back in, the DAW has to know what channel is that coming back in on. Now, Cubase, Logic, Studio One, Nuendo, and others allow you to choose whatever input and output. They don't have to match up. In other words, going out of output 3, coming back in input 3. But in Pro Tools, you have whatever channel you're going out of, you have to come back into that channel or it just won't work, all right? And so what you want to do is figure out how to create the hardware insert. You also have to go into your analog I/O settings within your DAW and assign those. These are not oftentimes pre-done. You're going to have to manually go in and set that up each time. So once you figure out how to create a hardware insert, right, within your DAW, then you figure out how to add it to your particular channel, right? In this situation, channel 10, a snare drum, to add it to that channel. Then you're ready to test it, right? And so then you're ready to make your physical connections. So let's use a 4-channel in and out example, right? Again, I've got 2 outputs feeding my studio monitors, so I've got 1 and 2 feeding my studio monitors, and I have 3 and 4 available to me for outputs. Now, I still have 4 inputs, but I only have 2 available outputs, right? So what I have to do is connect either channel 3 or channel 4 on my interface to the input, right, of the outboard compressor. In this example would be 1176 clone, like a Clark Technique or like a Warm Audio or Audioscape or Stam Audio. So many other ones out there that all vary in quality and tone and all of those things. There's a lot out there. Now I'm going to have to go get my dogs because they just started barking and it's going to drive me nuts. I'm sorry, my dog started barking, so I had to do this little transition. So anyway, in this example, we're talking about adding a hardware insert to the snare drum track on channel 10 in your interface. And so on your interface. In this example, we're using a 4 in and 4 out as an example. It could be 8 in, 8 out. It could be expanded beyond that, but for the sake of discussion, we're just going to talk about 4 in and 4 out. So out of your outputs, 1 and 2 typically would be used to feed the signal to your studio monitor. So of course you can listen to what you're doing while you're tracking and mixing. All right. That leaves available to you in this example 3 and 4 to use as available outputs. Now you still have in this example inputs 1 through 4, but you only have 2 outputs. 4 inputs available, 2 outputs, right? And so you have to be able to go in and tell your DAW what output are you going to use. So let's use this. We're going to come out of output 3 because 1 and 2 are used for the studio monitor. So I have 3 and 4 available. I'm going to come out of output 3 and I'm going to plug that into the input of my outboard piece of gear. In this example would be like an 1176 clone or something like this. I'm not going to recommend that you go out and buy a Universal Audio 1176 right out of the gate. I'm probably going to, as we start getting into specifics, talk about brands like Worm Audio, Clark Technique, Audioscape, Stam Audio, and so many others, Hairball, Purple Audio. There's so many out there that make so many fantastic reproductions at a lower cost than the original gear. Some of it may or may not be quite as good as the original gear, but it's pretty doggone good. So, and of course the mileage varies a little bit by that. So you're going to come out of output 3 on your interface, go into the input of, let's just say, a Warm Audio 1176, right? Then we're going to come out of the output of the 1176 and then bring that back in to an input on your interface. Now, I said before, you can pick and choose what inputs and outputs in configuration that you want to use. You can do that. That said, I still tend to recommend going in and out on the same channels in and out just to keep it straight in your head. Because especially if you want to start patching in multiple things later on, there's many options that come into play for that. I won't get into that just yet, right? So you're going out of your interface, channel 3, into the 1176 clone, out of the 1176 clone, physically connected back into the input of your interface. Now, your interface may or may not have either XLR, standard mic cables, right, as they're balanced, right? It may include those as ins and outs, and it also may include quarter-inch balanced, which quarter-inch balanced means that it looks like a stereo headphone jack and not a mono, like a guitar cable. That would not be stereo. That wouldn't be a balance. That would just be a mono cable. So you want to be, and I don't say mono and stereo in the stereo effect. It's keeping, all the things that need to be done to ensure you've got a solid signal. Because I could go into a deep well of discussing the reasons behind that, but that's just going to confuse some people. Okay, so anyway, you can buy patch cables. So let's say, for example, you've got your interface has quarter-inch ins and outs, but your outboard hardware only has XLR. Well, just buy an adapter. You can buy an adapter or a cable that goes from XLR male or female to quarter-inch balanced, and you can patch them in that way. Okay, so that's how you do the physical connection. So again, you have to set up the hardware insert within your digital audio workstation, telling your digital audio workstation what outputs are you going to send out of your interface to your outboard hardware, and then what input are you going to bring that back in on. You then have to go back and set up your I/O. You have to assign these things within your interface's I/O options. And again, all that varies from one DAW to another. Is how do you do that? Just simply do a Google or YouTube search on understanding assigning inputs and outputs in whatever DAW you're using, and just follow what you learned there. So once you get that all set up and you've got that, you've made your physical connections. Now, if you've done everything correctly, you should be ready to test it. So then you should be able to hit play on your transport bar in your DAW, and that signal should come out of that hardware insert on your channel strip, out to that compressor and back in. And so as you turn your dials and you set your attack and release and your threshold and your gain, those type of things and all the various things that you've got to set in a compressor as an example, you get that dialed into what you want, and that way you can tweak away. Now that's testing for doing it during mixing, okay? That's the way you want to do it if you're mixing a track. Now, mixing through analog can be problematic, okay? It's exciting and it's fun, but what you have to watch out for, if you've watched some videos before, you've heard people talking about recall when using outboard gear. And that's one of the reasons our new way of working today with plugins and automation and things like that is we don't have to worry about that. But back in the day, and including today, if you're using analog hardware for mixing, you're going to have to log your settings, right? Record your settings somehow, whatever works for your organization style. So a week later, you pull that mix back up. You're not having to dial in that exact same setting again and try and figure it out. You're going to take your knobs and put them where they were the last time you were there. If you need to tweak, you tweak. But you've got to keep a log of that. So that's the downside to some of this, okay? So it's not, in my opinion, as practical for mixing. Now, that said, where I tend to use outboard gear during mixing is I always have my master bus processor being done via analog. So that's the one thing. If you're not sure about that, that's another video. Okay? Don't get hung up on that just yet. I also, my key tracks. In other words, if I've got 3 compressors, let's say in my studio, 3 different ones, I may use, depending on which one, I may use one on my snare drum, one on my lead vocal, all right, and another maybe on my background vocals. Whatever is prominent and your most important tracks within a session is where you would want to put that. I also like to do it on my drum bus. Like a pair of distressors on my drum bus sounds fantastic, but that's going too far for many of you in this situation, right? And so the real key to this for me is if you're going to incorporate analog hardware is you're trying to capture the tonality of that hardware as you're tracking. So as an example, let's say you're recording an acoustic guitar, right? So if you've got an acoustic guitar, and let's say you've got an outboard compressor, let's say an LA2A this time. Maybe you've got a Warm Audio LA2A or a Clark Technique LA2A. And maybe you've modified it to get it to sound a little bit better. There's lots of threads out there about that, upgrading tubes and things like that to get more mileage out of these more entry-level economical outboard gear. But the only thing you've got to watch out for there is some of it, if it's too economical, it may not actually beat the plug-in, okay? So you got to take that with a grain of salt as you're thinking about these things. So when you're tracking, when you're doing it, so again, acoustic guitar, right? So obviously, I've got a guitar right here playing, right? I've mic'd that guitar for what I'm looking for, typically large diaphragm condenser on the 12th fret, maybe about 18 inches away, angled towards a sound hole a little bit slightly, but that varies between songs and how you need that acoustic guitar. If it's a small little trio, as an example, that guitar may be more prominent, so you may need more full range for it. If it's in a dense mix, you don't want a lot of low end in that acoustic guitar. It's just going to get muddy as crap. Actually, an acoustic guitar is probably one of the few things that I actually do track with compression and EQ. I don't typically do EQ because you can't come back from that. You can lightly use compression just a little bit, and you're not going to be committed in case it doesn't work in the mix. So what I like to do with my hardware is track on the way in. So in this situation, it would be different than what we had before. I would not use my hardware insert for this. Again, let's say, for example, I've got a large diaphragm condenser, okay? And there's plenty of economical versions of those microphones as well. And so I'm now recording. I've got the mic set up where I want it, right? And so now I've got that going into a dedicated microphone preamp. Now, I'm not using in this example, because we haven't talked about mic preamps yet, I'm not using the mic preamps on my interface. I'm using outboard microphone preamps, whether they're in a 500 series rack or they're your standard 19-inch rack, okay? So let's say, for example, I want to go out to a Neve clone mic preamp. So I've got that large diaphragm condenser connected up to the input of the Neve. Now, the output of the Neve, if I just wanted to use that mic preamp, then I would bring that back into an input on my interface, and now I'm just recording the mic preamp alone. But if I want to capture the compression at the same time, then physically connect the mic cable from the mic to the input of your outboard microphone preamp, and then come out of your outboard microphone preamp and go into the input of your compressor. And this example would be an LA2A clone. Come out of your LA2A clone, all right? And then bring that into the input of your interface. And then when you assign that track to be recorded within your DAW, choose the input that you brought, that you connected the output of the LA2A compressor. And then that way, when you hit record, you're going to hear, obviously, the tonality of the mic preamp. You're also going to hear the compression because you are committing that, okay? So you have to understand what commit means, because one of the advantages of working with plugins is you don't have to commit. You can change your mind at any one time, but when you track on the way in, you are locking in what you do on the way in. So that's why I always highly recommend take it easy, take it slow until you learn it. Once you get those tracks into your session and you start mixing, you'll learn lessons what to do and what not to do depending on the style of music that you're doing. So once you get a full grasp of that, then you can start pushing it a little bit more. You can start going all in. And once you get it down and you know exactly what you're looking for, you're dialing in that compression and you're off to the races and you don't think about it again. But that requires a confidence level, experience, a good set of ears, and knowing what sounds good and what doesn't, and how that's going to impact with other tracks. Again, you don't make the mistake of analyzing it just on its own by soloing it as an example. So that's just, you're just hearing the snare drum. Unsolo it, hear the snare drum in the entire mix, and then adjust. Okay? And that I guess I went back to the snare drum instead of the acoustic guitar. But then adjust it and tweak it so it fits in the mix, not on its own, right? So these are some fundamental principles to understanding, one, what do you got to do before you do anything else? Before you even consider buying a piece of gear, you've got to know how to do these basic things. And so these are things that you can practice on just to set up and learn how to do before you even order that first piece of gear, so that when you get that first piece of gear in, you know how to connect it up, you know when to use it as a hardware insert, and you know when to use it as your front end channel strip signal. And you can go back and forth. And that's one of the advantages of incorporating a patch bay. You can buy a 1/4-inch balanced patch bay for like $75. And so they're dirt cheap. And you can have all these various inputs and outputs of your interface wired, always connected to your patch bay. And then you can have the ins and outs of whatever hardware, outboard hardware you're using, wired into the back of the patch bay. So if you want to go from one to the next, it's a simple patch cable going out of one and into the next. You're not having to crawl back behind it, undo cables, put stress and everything on those cables and everything else. So if you are going to go down that road and you buy more than one or two pieces, you'll want to consider a patch bay. And I have several videos on my channel clearly describing how to use a patch bay, understanding normal, non-normal, half normal, these kinds of things. It's important that you understand that when you do it, but it's actually quite simple once you wrap your head around it. And then I also show examples of how I have my patch bay wired up, because I have everything in my studio through two separate Bantam patch bays. And the Bantam just uses the old style mini little connector that is more familiar. Most of you guys are too young to remember this, but back in the day in the 40s and 50s and 30s, they used Bantam cables to patch in telephone calls, right? And so that's where that technology comes from, if you didn't know. So hopefully this helps paint a picture for you, get a basic understanding. The next few videos coming out, I'm going to talk about specific gear, very specific gear, and how I use it within my workflow, and some of the advantages and disadvantages. I'd like to tell you I'm going to be able to give you a perfect solution for you, but there's so many variables that come into play. I'm going to have to, kind of generalize it a little bit to help the masses. So I hope you like the things I've talked about here today. Hopefully it's helped you grow and learn a little bit more, at least get a solid foundation, understanding how all of this works and the things that you have to learn and be able to do if you want to be able to do this, right? So this is an intermediate kind of video. It's not for the experienced user. Experienced user, you would have already learned this probably, most likely, all right? So hopefully it helps you, okay? And if you're progressing further on down the road and you are a more experienced user, I have plenty of videos out there talking to you. And so I encourage you to go check those out. So again, like I said in the beginning, I'd appreciate if you'd support my channel. It means a lot to me. It's super important. It helps me grow it. I don't do sponsorships from outside sources. That's how most YouTubers make their money. They don't actually make it from the views or anything like that. They make it from Sweetwater and these gear manufacturers and all this stuff paying them to review their products. And that's what usually a lot of that is done. Or they're advertising within that person's particular channel. Not saying there's anything wrong with that. I've just chosen not to do that because I don't want people to ever perceive that I'm ever influenced in any way. So again, I do this to help you. And so hopefully if you do me a favor, hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell. I'd really appreciate it. Okay. And hopefully it's helping you because I work hard to put a lot of content out there for you. So do me a favor, leave some comments down below. Any questions you may have, more than happy to try to answer them if I can. Please understand I've got hundreds of videos out there already. So I try to stay on top of comments, but the further into this I get, the harder and harder that becomes. Okay. So I do try very hard to stay on top of that and stay engaged. So do me a favor, let's talk down there, but let's keep it cool. Hey, we're all trying to learn from each other, not criticize each other. Okay. So until next time, every one of you have a great day. All right. Bye-bye.